When we designed our new vegetable garden a few years ago, we included a space for a square foot garden. This style of gardening is not new, but it remains very popular with both beginning gardeners and experienced gardeners alike. It's actually quite a lot like our intensive bed system, and the main goal of both of these is to plant as many plants as we can in the available space, and we do this by adjusting our plant density. So I'm going to use some colored stakes, plant stakes, to look at traditional plant spacing in a row crop system. We would have a suggested space between each plant in a row. So for example, potatoes, you usually space about a foot apart. And so within the row, each plant has 1 foot spacing, but then between rows, if we move off on this angle, imagine several rows of potatoes next to each other, we would have a 3 foot spacing. So our next row of potatoes would be way out here. And then another row, if we had that many potatoes, or maybe it's a different crop, would be again 3 feet down. But if you look at the root system of a plant, it doesn't really fill this space. So using this method, we end up basically with a rectangle where each plant can grow. So this would be the little rectangle for the first potato plant, right? But if we look at the root system of the plant, it doesn't really grow like that. I dug up a chart here, and you could see, since our soil's actually wet for once this year, we've got all the soil clinging on the root system. And it's definitely not a big rectangle, right? Typically, the root system grows in a circle around the main axis of the plant. And this is true for chard, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, whatever crop we're growing. So the idea between both the intensive bed gardening and the square foot gardening is to give each plant the amount of space it needs to grow. So basically we're giving it a circle to grow in. And so with that in mind, we would tighten up these rows. So we would put our rows equally apart as our in-row spacing. So our between the rows would be the same as our in-row spacing. So in that case, we would have rows 1 foot apart. And this allows us to have many more plants in a small area. Now we've done this, you could see, with our intensive bed system, and we're going to apply the same concept to the square foot garden. Now with our square foot garden, you want to start by thinking about this as an intensive bed shrunk down a bit. We want to shrink it down to a size where we could comfortably reach in from all sides of the garden. Mine is 3 foot by 3 foot, and I made that a little bit more limited. Usually they're 4 foot by 4 foot, but they're typically built with a wood frame that's a 2 by 6 inch board of wood, so we don't have as much of an edge. I've used a stone edge, so I've reduced the size so I can reach better. Now, we raise the bed also. That's typical of a square foot garden, and the reason for that is to improve the drainage and also to create a very rich soil base to start with. And that'll get our plants off to a good start. A typical mixture would be native soil mixed with compost and maybe a little perlite for extra drainage. Once you have your frame established, you want to put a planting grid in, and I've built one out of bamboo, and this is used to divide the garden into equal 1 foot sections. And then once we have that in place, we could begin looking at the planting density within here. So for our larger growing plants, our potatoes, our peppers, tomatoes, okra, and our broccoli, we can only fit 1 plant per square, and that's based on giving each plant just the amount of room it needs for its root system. For our kind of medium-large plants, like our corn and our chard, those we can actually fit 4 plants per square foot. The next level, we kind of think of, there's 4 typical levels, the 1 per foot, the 4 per foot, then there's a 9 plant per foot, like I have my beans here. We can also do lettuces and onions at this density. And then our smallest plant, our radishes, our peas, our leeks, and our carrots, we can actually fit 16 plants per square. And when you're planting these, you want to think of dividing the square in a grid. So kind of taking a subgrid like this inside, and we'll put a plant equally spaced throughout here. Now there's a few plants I didn't mention, mainly our vining crops. So I have some cucumbers here, and if we just planted a cucumber and let it sprawl along the ground, it would cover our planting bed. But what I want to do is grow it vertically up this trellis. And these kind of break away from the 1, 4, 9, 16. We're going to actually just put 2 plants per square foot. We can do the same thing with some of our melons, like the cantaloupe. We can actually grow those up a trellis and use little slings to support the weight of the fruit. Now these are a little bit larger, and we're only going to plant 1 for 2 squares. So 1 plant would require 2 squares. And so I would maybe pull these out and put it in the middle of these 2 squares. Another vining crop that we want to think about are summer squash. Now we can grow summer squash. There's vining plants and there's bush plants. But the bush plants take up a lot of room. In fact, I would only be able to fit 1 squash and nothing else in this 9 square garden. It would take up all 9 squares. But we can use vining type squash and grow them up our trellis the same way we would the cantaloupe, with 1 plant taking up 2 squares.